Welcome to the Mark Twain on Mormonism video. Mark Twain was fascinated with everything connected with Mormonism, especially polygamy. And Mark Twain visited Salt Lake City, Utah sometime in the 1860s. I saw in one source that it was 1861, but I'm not sure about that. This was an article, Deseret News, 2017. Okay, Mark Twain in the Roughing It book, 1872. We changed horses and took supper with a Mormon destroying angel. Destroying angels, as I understand it, are Latter-day Saints who are set apart by the church to conduct permanent disappearances of obnoxious citizens. So, kind of like North Korea or China. Pictured above here, we have Wild Bill Hickman. This might have been who he was talking about. He was a destroying angel for the prophet Brigham Young, and he wrote an expose, a book we'll show on another slide. All right, Mark Twain, in an article entitled Christian Science in 1907, he says, Mormonism had all the requisites but one. It had nothing new and nothing valuable to bait with, and besides, it appealed to the stupid and the ignorant only. So everything is a remix. You know, Joseph Smith got a lot of the stuff for the Mormon Church in other sources. So what he's saying, nothing new under the sun, probably mostly true. You know, he took from sources that influenced him and made up the religion. And he says a little bit more about these Mormon destroying angels. Twain says, I had heard a deal about these Mormon destroying angels and the dark and bloody deeds that they had done. And when I entered this one's house, he doesn't say who it is, I had my shudder all ready, I guess ready to be scared. And here's that book by Wild Bill Hickman. It's called Brigham's Destroying Angel, The Life, Confession, and Startling Disclosures of the Notorious Bill Hickman, the day-night chief of Utah. Brigham Young basically sent him out to do the dirty work and to kill his enemies. All right, Twain continues in the book Roughing It. But alas, for all our romances, he was nothing but a loud, profane, offensive old blackguard, which means dishonorable. Talking about these destroying angels again. He was murderous enough, possibly to fill the bill of a destroyer, but would you have any kind of an angel devoid of dignity? Could you abide an angel in an unclean shirt and no suspenders? So he's being funny here. Could you respect an angel with a horse laugh and a swagger like a buccaneer? This might have been Wild Bill Hickman. Might have been Orrin Porter Rockwell as well. Here's that first edition of Brigham's Destroying Angel of that book by Bill Hickman. So Mark Twain was not a big fan of the Mormon Church. This is from a letter to Miss Kate Field in 1886. He says, Am I a friend to the Mormon religion? No. I would like to see it extirpated. Now, extirpated means destroyed completely. So he wants to see the Mormon religion destroyed completely, but always by fair means. And he'll tell us what those are on the next slide. This meme here, or this picture, it says, Science, always doubt, always question. When challenged, you reply with evidence. Religion, no doubts, no questions. When challenged, you become hostile. So that's really the way it is in the Mormon Church too. You're not supposed to doubt. And if you doubt, then you're supposed to doubt your doubts. And Twain continues in the same letter, if you can destroy it with a book, and he's talking about Mormonism, if you can destroy it with a book by arguments and facts, not with brute force, so not with violence, but with arguments and facts, you will do a good and wholesome work. And he continues, and I should be very far from unwilling to publish such a book. In case my business decks were clear, they are not clear now. And he says they would not be clear for up to 4 years. So he said he's very far from unwilling to publish such a book. So he really thought about publishing a whole book on the Mormons. But he did put quite a bit into the book Roughing It. And he was fascinated with polygamy, as a lot of people were back in the time. He said, we felt a curiosity to ask every child how many mothers it had, and if it could tell them apart. All right, a statement by Mark Twain in the autobiography of Mark Twain, Volume 2. This was dictated in 1906. The Book of Mormon, engraved upon metal plates, was dug up out of the ground by Joseph Smith, a man of no repute and of no authority. And upon this extravagantly doubtful document, the Mormon Church was built. So he calls the Book of Mormon an extravagantly doubtful document. This Book of Mormon is from the time period what Mark Twain was from. So this might have been the Book of Mormon that Mark Twain had. And back to Roughing It, Twain says, the acting governor of the territory introduced us to other Gentiles, and we spent a sociable hour with them. Gentiles are people who are not Mormons. And then he talks about the whiskey that was made by the Mormons. Yes, Brigham Young was a distiller, and he made whiskey along with other Mormons and general authorities. He says it was the exclusively Mormon refresher Valley Tan. Valley Tan is a kind of whiskey, or a first cousin to it. It is of Mormon invention and manufactured only in Utah. Tradition says that it is made of imported fire and brimstone. And here we have a picture of this bottle is an actual bottle of Valley Tan whiskey, an old bottle. Valley Tan whiskey is distilled from wheat and potatoes and was sold at the church-owned ZCMI. All right, Mark Twain and some correspondence with the San Francisco Alta, California in 1867. I guess that was a newspaper. He says, young Joe had better look out. He's talking about Joseph Smith III, leader and prophet of the reorganized church. That was the church that Emma Smith, that's the wife of Joseph Smith, and the son of Joseph Smith III, started. There was quite a bit of competition between Brigham Young and this reorganized church. Most of the Mormons went to Utah, but a certain number stayed behind in this reorganized church, and Brigham Young did not like them. So Twain says, young Joe had better look out, for it has been a well-credited rumor in Keokuk, Iowa, for 2 years or more, that Brigham Young has set a price upon his head and keeps a destroying angel or so on his track all the time, ready to kill him when the opportunity offers. So this was the rumor going around. Brigham Young has set a price upon Joseph Smith III's head and keeps a destroying angel or so on his track all the time. So kind of like what they would do in a communist country. Ready to kill him when the opportunity offers. And they say that if these Mormons were to start to Salt Lake, in other words, the leaders of the reorganized church, if they were to start to Salt Lake, young Joe would never get out of the sight of Council Bluffs, Iowa, alive. So that Iowa's on the way, I guess, and he would have never gotten out of there alive because Brigham Young would have put a hit on him. And here we have a picture of Joseph Smith III. It's Joseph Smith's son, leader and prophet of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. All right, back to Roughing It. The Mormon crest was easy, and it was simple, unostentatious, and fitted like a glove. It was a representation of a golden beehive with the bees all at work, because the Mormons are and were hard workers. This is a doorknob, I think, in the Lion House, so it shows that golden beehive, and around it it says, "Holiness to the Lord." So then he talks about meeting Brigham Young face to face. He says, the second day that they were in Utah, we made the acquaintance of a Mr. Street, since deceased, and put on white shirts and went and paid a state visit to the king. It's interesting how he calls Brigham Young a king. Went and paid a visit to the king of the Utah Territory. He seemed a quiet, kindly, easy-mannered, dignified, self-possessed old gentleman of 55 or 60, and had a gentle craft in his eye that probably belonged there. And he says Brigham Young was dressed very simply and was just taking off a straw hat as we entered. Straw hat pictured above with the BYU symbol on it. Of course, that's the university named after Brigham Young. He talked about Utah and the Indians and Nevada and general American matters and questions. And then Twain says, Brigham Young never paid any attention to me, notwithstanding I made several attempts to draw him out on federal politics and his high-handed attitude towards Congress. But Brigham Young didn't pay any attention to him. So kind of what I think of as, the king sitting in his house, just kind of very quiet and silent, just looking at the guests, maybe not fully trusting them, and maybe asking a few questions here and there of the guests, but kind of sitting there like a king or a mob boss. Some people like the mob in The Sopranos. So Mark Twain really didn't like the fact that he got ignored. He says, by and by I subsided into an indignant, angry silence, and so sat until the end, hot and flushed, and execrating him in my heart for an ignorant savage. In other words, loathing him in my heart as an ignorant savage. But he says Brigham Young was calm. His conversation with those gentlemen flowed on as sweetly and peacefully and musically as any summer brook. The petrified truth is that Utah is an absolute monarchy and Brigham Young is the king. Here you see Brigham Young in a fairly nice suit. So Brigham Young, similar to this guy, sitting on his throne with his crown. Brigham Young really was the king of the Utah Territory theocracy, or what he tried to start as the state of Deseret. With the gushing self-sufficiency of youth, I was feverish to plunge in headlong and achieve a great reform here. And he's talking about polygamy. Wanted to achieve a great reform until I saw the Mormon women. Then I was touched. My heart was wiser than my head. It warmed toward these poor, ungainly, and pathetically homely creatures, and as I turned to hide the generous moisture in my eyes, I said, no, the man that marries one of them has done an act of Christian charity which entitles him to the kindly applause of mankind, not their harsh censure. So he's making kind of a joke here. It's kind of funny, saying that the Mormon women, the polygamous wives, are very homely, and the man that marries 60 of them, kind of like Brigham Young, has done a deed of open-handed generosity so sublime that the nations should stand uncovered in his presence and worship in silence. And then he goes back to the violence in Utah issue. He says, it is a luscious country for thrilling evening stories about assassinations of intractable Gentiles. So there was rumors and I think some truth that there were some assassinations going on of intractable Gentiles or apostates. And then Mark Twain mentions the Morrisite War. I had never really heard of this before. but there is a Wikipedia article about it. He says, I cannot easily conceive of anything more cozy than the night in Salt Lake, which we spent in a Gentile den, smoking pipes and listening to tales of how Burton galloped in among the pleading and defenseless Morosites and shot them down, men and women, like so many dogs. So I looked up a little bit about this. It was General Robert T. Burton, a prominent Mormon and subsequently bishop bishop of the 15th Ward in Salt Lake City. He commanded the 1,000-member posse, and I guess they went in and wiped out some of the Morosites, which I guess was a breakoff group from the church, and looked at as apostates, by Brigham Young. And here's a monument entitled the Kington Fort Morosite War Site. This monument was placed here to commemorate a 3-day little-known battle that occurred 13, 14, and 15 of June, 1862. So, Mark Twain was following this kind of stuff. He kind of knew what was going on. And then he mentions another act of violence by the Wild Bill Hickman, a destroying angel, who shot Charles Drown and Josiah Arnold dead for bringing a suit against him for a debt. So Wild Bill Hickman shot down Charles Drown and Josiah Arnold dead. And I believe this is the gravestone for both of them. Charles M. Drown, he died in 1859, and Josiah Arnold died in 1859. About a week apart from each other. And then he mentions Orrin Porter Rockwell, who did this and that dreadful thing. And then he talks about the heedless people who often come to Utah and make remarks about Brigham or polygamy or some other sacred matter, maybe about the temple. And the very next morning at daylight, such parties are sure to be found lying up some back alley, contentedly waiting for the hearse. Make fun of Brigham, polygamy, the temple, or anything sacred. Such parties are sure to be found lying dead in a back alley, killed by the Mormons. And then he talks a little bit more about polygamy. And the next most interesting thing is to sit and listen to these Gentiles talk about polygamy and how some portly old frog of an elder, see above, or a bishop marries a girl, likes her and marries her sister, likes her, marries another sister, likes her, takes another, and likes her and marries her mother. You can marry the whole family, a couple sisters, maybe a mother. And how the pert young thing of 11 will chance to be the favorite wife, and her own venerable grandmother have to rank away down toward D4 in their mutual husband's esteem and have to sleep in the kitchen. So he's just talking about these Mormon general authorities probably preferring their younger wives. He mentions an 11-year-old, not sure if they went quite down that young. And how this dreadful sort of thing, this hiving together in one foul nest of mothers and daughters, and the making of a young daughter superior to her own mother in rank and authority. And these are things which Mormon women submit to because their religion teaches them that the more wives a man has on earth and the more children that he rears, the higher the place they will all have in the world to come. They'll have a greater posterity, right? A lot more spirit children, be able to have a bigger kingdom. And according to these Gentile friends of ours, Brigham Young's harem contains 20 or 30 wives. I think the actual number grew up to 55, but maybe that's how many he had at the time, 20 or 30. They said that some of them had grown old and gone out of active service. Gone out of active service. And some of them didn't even live in Salt Lake. And according to a friend of Mark Twain, Brigham Young said the following: I have wives all over this territory of Utah. I have dozens of wives whose numbers even I do not know without looking in the family Bible. They are scattered far and wide across the mountains and the valleys of my realm. And Brigham Young supposedly said, I am rich and everybody knows it. I am benevolent and everybody takes advantage of it. And he's talking about his wives and children. If he gives one thing to one of them, then he has to give that same thing to all of them. So that ends up costing him a lot of money. And I believe this is the Lion House, at least one big long part of it. So you kind of see pretty big house to house all of Brigham Young's children and wives. And then he gets back to the Book of Mormon. He says, all men have heard of the Mormon Bible, but few except the elect have seen it, or at least taken the trouble to read it. And he's talking about the 3 witnesses, the 8 witnesses, the elect who have actually seen the plates, the golden plates, or as Mark Twain calls them, copper plates. Few have taken the trouble to read it. The Book of Mormon is a curiosity to me. It is such a pretentious affair, and yet so slow, so sleepy, such an insipid mess of inspiration. In other words, lacking interest. So he says the Book of Mormon is pretentious, very slow to read, very sleepy, and lacking interest for most people. And we now come to Mark Twain's most famous statement about Mormonism. He says, the Book of Mormon is chloroform in print. Chloroform is a colorless solvent used to render somebody unconscious. I guess back in the 1860s, 1870s, to put somebody unconscious. So again, the Book of Mormon is slow and sleepy and boring, and if you read it, you'll go unconscious. This is not entirely untrue. And even my father, who's still an active Mormon, says how boring it is to read the Book of Mormon. And here is that bottle blown up bigger. Chloroform, Duncan's Pure Chloroform, British ethylic alcohol. And then this is a pretty funny comment. If Joseph Smith composed the book, the act was a miracle. Keeping awake while he did it was, at any rate. Keeping awake while he wrote the Book of Mormon was a miracle. That's pretty funny. And he says, the Book of Mormon seems to be merely a prosy or a dull, unimaginative detail of imaginary history. So Mark Twain was able to pick up on that right from the beginning. It's not a historical book. It's an imaginary history. You know, they've never found any of the geography of where it took place. Anyway, that's another video. With the Old Testament for a model. Yep, it's got Old Testament stuff in it. Followed by a tedious plagiarism of the New Testament. Yep. I believe about 25% of the Book of Mormon is basically taken right out of the Holy Bible. Got all the Isaiah passages. You have the Sermon on the Mount. You just have stuff that's taken right out of there. A good book on this is Joseph Smith's Plagiarism of the Bible in the Book of Mormon by Gerald and Sandra Tanner. The result is a mongrel. So the Book of Mormon is half modern glibness, showing little forethought, and half ancient simplicity and gravity. The latter is awkward and constrained, the former natural, but grotesque by the contrast. So whenever Joseph Smith found his speech growing too modern, which was about every sentence or two, he ladled in a few such scriptural phrases as exceedingly sore or exceeding sore, and it came to pass, etc., and made things satisfactory again. So Twain may have been picking up on the anachronisms. You know, things like having a compass, steel, horses, different animals that are out of place. Whenever he found his speech growing too modern, which was about every sentence or two, he put in some old stuff in there to balance it. And it came to pass was his pet. Joseph Smith loved to use the phrase, and it came to pass. This was his pet. If he had left that out, his Bible would have been only a pamphlet. Well, that's not true, but it's still pretty funny. And Twain picked up on the idea that a lot of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, were all from the same families. He noticed that 4 of the 8 witnesses were Whitmers, and he made a comment on that in the book Roughing It. 3 more of the 8 were Smiths, and there was only one other person, Hiram Page, of the 8 witnesses. So yeah, they're all from the same families except for a few. He says the first book of Nephi is a plagiarism of the Old Testament. Equipped with their compass, these ancients appear to have had the advantage of Noah. I guess because Noah did not have a compass, had the advantage of Noah. So Twain may be picking up on the fact that around 600 BC, there was nothing, there was no compasses. Twain also mentions how the Book of Mormon in Jacob chapter 2 regards polygamy as an abomination. So that's pretty interesting. So Twain is familiar with Brigham Young's polygamy especially, and then he's wondering, well, why in the Book of Mormon does it say that polygamy is an abomination? So we'll read a little bit about what Twain is talking about here in Jacob chapter 2. Hearken to the word of the Lord, for there shall not any man among you have save it be one wife, and concubines ye shall have none. For I, the Lord God, delight in the chastity of women, and whoredoms are an abomination before me, thus saith the Lord of hosts. Having more than one wife, or having concubines, is a whoredom and an abomination. So why did Joseph Smith have so many wives and even concubines? And same goes for Brigham Young and several prophets after Brigham Young, if it says it's an abomination in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Ether is an incomprehensible medley of history, quote unquote. So notice how he puts the word history in quotes. So in other words, not a real history. Much of it relating to battles and sieges among peoples whom the reader has possibly never heard of, and who inhabited a country which is not set down in the geography. So Twain noticed this as well, that there was no geography for the Book of Mormon. We don't know where the cities are. And the above here, pictured here, is a map put out by the Mormon Church that relates to no real map. It's just a map of Book of Mormon lands relative to each other, because the church has never ever said where the geography is. The Mormon Bible is rather stupid and tiresome to read, but there is nothing vicious in its teachings. Its code of morals is unobjectionable. It is smooched from the New Testament, and no credit is given. And Mark Twain was actually pretty interested in the Mountain Meadows Massacre as well. He heard a number of stories when he was in Utah about it. He said, "We were told, for instance, that the dreadful Mountain Meadows Massacre was the work of the Indians entirely." That's not true. And that the Gentiles had meanly tried to fasten it upon the Mormons. And we were told likewise that the Indians were to blame partly, and partly the Mormons. I think it's like 90% the Mormons' fault. And we were also told likewise, and just as positively, that the Mormons were almost, if not wholly and completely responsible for that most treacherous and pitiless butchery. It was not until several years afterward that a Mrs. C.V. Waite's book, The Mormon Prophet and His Harem, came out with Judge Cradlebaugh's trial of the accused parties in it, and revealed the truth that the later version was the correct one. In other words, the Mormons were responsible for it. and that the Mormons were the assassins. Pictured above here is Judge Cradlebow. Interesting guy, and he did write quite a bit about the Mormons. And here's the title page of a Mrs. C.V. Waite's book, The Mormon Prophet and His Harem. And we had overheard and noted the tenor of conversations among drivers, conductors, and hostlers, and finally among the citizens of Salt Lake, until we were well aware that these superior beings, the Mormons, despised immigrants. That's true. They really didn't like outsiders in the early days of Utah. The Mormons have been hunted and hounded from one end of the country to the other, and the result is that for years they have hated all Gentiles indiscriminately and with all their might. That might be a little over the top. Joseph Smith was driven from state to state with his mysterious copper plates and the miraculous stones that he read their inscriptions with. So that's pretty interesting. Mark Twain knew about the seer stones, knew that he used them to read the inscriptions on the copper plates. So that's pretty interesting. Mark Twain knew about that. The Mormons were badgered and harried again by their neighbors in Nauvoo, Illinois. All the proclamations that Joseph Smith could issue denouncing polygamy and repudiating it as utterly anti-Mormon were of no avail. And the Nauvoo expositor broke the story that, yes, Joseph Smith was indeed practicing polygamy, and he had a couple dozen wives. And it was a reliable source, this Nauvoo expositor, because it was a member of the first presidency, William Law, one of the main guys that's responsible for the Nauvoo expositor, who was on the inside with Joseph Smith. And William Law was definitely against polygamy, and so he broke the story in this first edition and only edition of the Nauvoo expositor, which Joseph Smith had destroyed. The people of the neighborhood on both sides of the Mississippi claimed that polygamy was practiced by the Mormons, and yes, indeed it was. Joseph Smith was keeping it a secret. Brigham Young and a small party crossed the country and founded the Great Salt Lake City, purposely choosing a land that was outside the ownership and jurisdiction of the hated American nation. They wanted to be outside of the regular country so that they could establish their theocracy. They really wanted to combine church and state, politics and ecclesiastical. In 1849, the Mormons organized a free and independent government and erected the state of Deseret with Brigham Young as its head. And I didn't really realize this, or maybe I forgot, but the state of Deseret had their own currency, and this is an example of one of those, on presentation of $100. But the very next year, Congress deliberately snubbed it and created the territory of Utah, but made Brigham Young governor of it. So I guess the state of Deseret was short-lived. And in the book, Roughing It, Mark Twain said that Brigham Young was a pious fraud. That's a term that's been used for Joseph Smith by people like Dan Vogel. But now you know that Mark Twain also used it as a statement about Brigham Young, that he was a pious fraud. So maybe he believed in what he was doing, even though what he was doing was a fraud. This meme here says, "Hi." Of course, that's a picture of Brigham Young. "I have 55 wives. I think that Adam is God. I ban blacks from the priesthood, and I'm a Mormon." Within 5 years, he, Brigham Young, openly added polygamy to the tenets of the church, which is something that really hadn't happened before. Joseph Smith kept it a secret, didn't really bring it out as an open teaching of the church, but Brigham Young did. They were out outside of the nation, out on their own theocracy. So he felt okay to openly start teaching polygamy, practicing polygamy. Added it to the tenets of the church by authority of a revelation which he pretended had been received 9 years before by Joseph Smith. And here's a quote from Brigham Young that seems to indicate that he did get the revelation from Joseph Smith. And Twain says, Brigham Young was president of all Mormondom, civil and ecclesiastical. So in other words, politics, the state, and the religion. He was president of the entire theocracy. And here's a book talking about the Mormon theocracy. It's in the Kingdom in the West series, The Mormons and the American Frontier. This one is volume 2. I think there's like 16 volumes in this series. It's pretty crazy. Pretty unknown, and I haven't really read any of them. This one is The Forgotten Kingdom, the Mormon Theocracy in the American West, 1847 to 1896, by David L. Bigler. I think these are well done from some good historians. And kind of a funny statement here. Brigham Young reached out modestly and proclaimed himself a god. Prophet, priest, and king is what they used to call it in the Council of the 50. Godhood comes on later in the next life, but it's interesting that Mark Twain mentioned that. And then Twain clarifies a little bit. Brigham Young claims that he is to have a heaven of his own in the hereafter, and that he will be its God. A heaven of his own in the hereafter, and he will be the God. And his wives and children, its goddesses, princes, and princesses. The meme here is, forget a private island, I want my own planet. That's kind of a Mormon thing. Becoming the god of your own planet. Mark Twain is not wrong about this. Into it, which is the heaven, all faithful Mormons will be admitted with their families and will take rank and consequence according to the number of their wives and children. If a disciple dies before he has had time to accumulate enough wives and children to enable him to be respectable in the next world, any friend can marry a few wives and raise a few children for him after he is dead, and that is done in the Mormon temple. And they are duly credited to his account. That's pretty funny. And his heavenly status is advanced accordingly. And pictured above, we have some saints in the temple with their temple clothes. Let it be borne in mind that the majority of the Mormons have always been ignorant, simple, of an inferior order of intellect. Not my words. These are Mark Twain, one of the most famous people in all of literature. And the Mormons are unacquainted with the world and its ways. Yes, they're kind of protected. They live in their own bubble. I think that certainly is the case in Utah. Mormons living in their own bubble, in their own ideas, and a lot of them don't really get that much exposure to the rest of the country, to the rest of the world. Political leaders were sent to Utah to break up the theocracy, but they saw every attempt to do their official duties find its reward in darker and darker looks and in secret threats and warnings of a more and more dismal nature. That's how the Mormons were. And at last they either succumbed and became despised tools and toys of the Mormons, or they got scared and discomforted beyond all endurance and left the territory. Because, the Mormons could scare people, and they were known to commit acts of violence. The territorial government established there had been a hopeless failure. That is, from the federal government, and trying to make it a regular state or a regular territory of the country, not just a Mormon empire. But this had been a hopeless failure, and Brigham Young was the only real power in the land. That was true, I guess, up until the time he died. Brigham Young, was an absolute monarch, a monarch who defied our president, a monarch who laughed at our armies when they camped about his capital. So Brigham Young was a monarch who received without emotion the news that the August Congress of the United States had enacted a solemn law against polygamy. And then Brigham Young went forth calmly and married 25 or 30 more wives. So they were defiant to the laws of the land and to Congress. The now almost forgotten Mountain Meadows Massacre was the Mormons' work. It was very famous in its day. That's 1857. The whole United States rang with its horrors. This Baker Fancher wagon train was rich, very rich in cattle, horses, mules, and other property. And how could the Mormons consistently keep up their coveted resemblance to the Israelitish tribes and not seize the spoil of an enemy when the Lord had so manifestly delivered it into their hands? To the victor go the spoils, I guess is what Twain is saying. Seize the spoil of an enemy when the Lord has delivered it into your hands. According to Mrs. C.V. Waite's entertaining book, The Mormon Prophet and His Harem, it transpired that a revelation from Brigham Young as Great Grand Archie or God, not sure what a Great Grand Archie is, revelation from Brigham Young as a god was dispatched to President J.C. Haight, Bishop Higbee, and John D. Lee, the adopted son of Brigham. So Brigham Young as a god commanding them to raise all the forces they could muster and trust, follow those cursed Gentiles, so read the revelation, attack them disguised as Indians, and with the arrows of the Almighty make a clean sweep of them. Leave none to tell the tale, and if they needed any assistance, they were commanded to hire the Indians as their allies, promising them a share of the booty. They were to be neither slothful nor negligent in their duty, and to be punctual in sending the teams back to Brigham Young before winter set in. Not sure if that is really what happened, like one of the main motivating factors of taking all their horses and cattle and stuff. All right, on the 10th day of September 1857 was consummated one of the most cruel, cowardly, and bloody murders known in our history. The number of persons butchered by the Mormons on this occasion was 120. That is true. That's an accurate number. I looked that up. Women, children, and men were killed. I think you had to be 8 years old or younger to be spared. Brigham Young failed to embody any account of this massacre in his report as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. Also, he failed to mention any allusion to it from the pulpit until several years later. The Deseret News, the only paper in the territory, failed to notice the massacre until several months afterward, and then only to deny that Mormons were engaged in it. Not sure if that is true, but it wouldn't surprise me. The children and the property of the immigrants were found in possession of the Mormons. That's probably true. And I really need to make a video about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and all of the cover-up that happened after. I know there was a lot of cover-up going on in the church with Brigham Young and whatnot, and I think that'd make an interesting video. But that's going to do it for this video. I'll bet you never knew how much Mark Twain had to say about the Mormons. There was a lot more than I thought there was. But that's going to do it for this video. And I thank you for watching the Mark Twain on Mormonism video.